There's an American cliche that we fought a war against fascism that is really ridiculously wrong. In the third and final installment of our interview with Professor Grover Furr, he tells us the USA wanted to defeat Nazism and not fascism because the imperial core needs fascism and used fascism all over the world decades after World War II. Furr also points out to us that the Nazis wanted to lay out their colonial agenda in Eastern Europe, eliminate the Jews, and enslave the Slavs. Unknown to the American public, a lot of the anti-communist talking points come directly from Nazi propaganda. He supplants his discontent with pointing out the famines were common and widespread and not isolated to Ukraine. In a quite controversial stance on the Katyn Massacre, Grover Furr tells us the Nazis were behind the atrocities and that Poland was one of the perpetrators of World War II. Imagine claiming the North in the American Civil War had committed genocide on Southern prisoners of war. You'd get laughed out of the room. We also ask him about women's rights and homosexuality. Admittedly, he tells us he's not an expert on the issue and offers us resources we absolutely plan on following up with in future episodes of The Red Lettuce. It's important to discover the truth, and Grover Furr tells us that we shouldn't trust anyone else in the journey to find it. He tells us we have to examine the evidence for ourselves. He offers us the sound advice of remaining objective because objectivity is lacking in the field of Soviet studies. If you aren't searching for the truth, you won't find it, and if you find it, you won't recognize it. We hope you take this opportunity to review what you know about history. If you have any thoughts or questions about the content in this video, please leave them in the comments so that we can address them directly. We understand a lot of this material is controversial, however, it's worth reviewing history to understand anti-communism so that it's easier to spot propaganda from the imperial core. Ask questions when the war machine puppets tell you there's election fraud and human rights violations in another country. Ask questions when there is a call for sanctions and war because the only losers in these scenarios are working class people and we have nothing to lose but our chains.
You write that the Nazis and Allied powers had more similarities than the Nazis in the USSR.
Yeah.
What were some of those policies, and was Order 227 the not one step back order an example of that?
Okay. Well, you read. Let's just deal with Order 227. In World War I, a British general and a Canadian general both made statements that are essentially the same as Order 227, not a step back. And you can read them there in my book. When I went to McGill University, which is in Montreal, and the gymnasium there was Sir Arthur Currie Memorial Gymnasium. And there's a statue of this guy, whoever he is, Sir Arthur Currie, in front of it. Well, Sir Arthur Currie, it turns out, was the commander-in-chief of Canadian forces in World War I. And he made a statement at a certain time and place, which is, I have it documented in that book, that the Canadian troops should advance and they should either die on the spot or continue to advance, that they should absolutely not retreat 1 inch. And I also quote a British general who had either that time or a different time made the same statement. The difference, of course, between that and Stalin's statement is that the Canadians and the British were not fighting for their homelands. They were not fighting against an enemy that was planning on wiping out all the Canadians and all the British and all the French. They were simply fighting over yards of mud somewhere along the French-Belgian border. That's it. Whereas the Soviets were fighting against an enemy which had declared that they were going to kill 80% of all the Slavs and enslave the rest of them. Okay? And they were already committing massive genocide against some of the population. So it's a completely different situation. And I pointed out how dishonest it is of Timothy Snyder, whose book I'm criticizing in that work, not to point this out. But I mean, that's a very good example, Snyder's book, Bloodlands, of a a monumental act of falsification. Anyway, so that's Order 227. Now, let me see. Oh yeah, well I just mentioned that. Yeah, okay. So what are the similarities between Nazi Germany? Well, I mean, they're capitalist countries. Hitler wanted to build an empire. Of course, that's what World War I was all about from the point of view of the Kaiser, right? The imperial German government. They wanted colonies. Germany had industrialized a little bit too late, and by the time Germany industrialized, the rest of the world was basically divided up among the imperialist powers. Well, Germany got a few islands in the Pacific. They got a few minor colonies in Africa. They got a couple of concessions in China, but basically they were frozen out of any major colonies because the British and the French had taken, and the Belgians had taken the lion's share of colonies. So it was really a battle over Germany, and of course Austria-Hungary trying to get some colonies. Okay, it's completely cynical. Woodrow Wilson said, of course, President Wilson said, this is a war for national self-determination, but none of the Allies took that seriously at all. They had no desire to liberate any of these colonies. They simply turned the German colonies over to the different Allies. Okay. World War II, or before World War II, Hitler had said, yeah, Germany needs colonies, but we're not going to try to take them away from the other imperialist powers. We're going to try to get our colony. We're going to have our colonies in Eastern Europe. Okay, we'll get rid of the Jews, we'll get rid of the communists, the West won't care about them, and that's where we're going to have our colonies, right? We're going to have our empire in the East, and so it was again a war an inter-imperialist war. Now that's also true in the Pacific, but we're not talking about the Pacific now. But the Pacific War was a war. Japan took over mainland China, and then it took over the French colonies in Indochina, the Dutch colonies in the East Indies. It was a war for Japan to become a major imperialist power on its own, and the United States, of course, didn't want to tolerate that, and ultimately the Japanese were defeated. So World War II is a colonial war. From the point of view of the interests of the majority of people, the working class, and certainly the people of the Soviet Union, though, it was a war to fight against Nazism. Okay, and many people thought it was a war against fascism, and so it might have been, except that after the war, as I'm sure you're aware, the Allies wanted to defeat Nazism. They didn't want to defeat fascism. They needed fascism, and they preserved fascism and encouraged fascism all around the world for decades after World War II. So Nazism was defeated. Fascism was not defeated, but and of course the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was really a very, very, very temporary and very shaky alliance. Neither side could really trust the other. In June 1945, immediately after the war, Winston Churchill had drawn up a plan called Operation Unthinkable, where the plan was, and the documents have now been published, that he wanted to rearm the German army and then send all of the Allied armies plus the rearmed German army against the Soviet Union. Okay, immediately, not waiting for the Cold War or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Germany was an imperialist power. Of course, the British and the French were terribly afraid that if Germany really had conquered the Soviet Union, then it would have been so powerful that it would have been able to basically write its own ticket. That the British and the French would have been second fiddle, right? And that's probably true. And there were capitalists. I mean, the similarities are overwhelming. The similarities are as an attempt to cover over the similarities with the word totalitarianism. I'm not going to go into that right here, but that's a bogus concept,
Right.
that was invented for the purpose of yoking the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany together to make them look like they were
The same.
similar. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Which is
I
crazy.
love to do that. And Applebaum, she loves to do that.
Yeah, totalitarian. Actually, I have it in one of my more recent books. It turns out that it's Leon Trotsky who was the first person
Right.
to use the term totalitarian to refer to the Soviet Union as well as to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And then this is picked up after the war. I'm not sure who else, but most famously picked up after the war by Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book called On Totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Which is a terrible book. Now, Arendt knew a lot about Nazi Germany. She knew basically nothing about the Soviet Union. But she realized that this was what was required, right? This is what we really need, a term that's going to yoke these two forces that seem so opposite, and of course in reality really were so opposite, together. That'll be very helpful for ideological propaganda purposes in the Cold War, and it's still going on. So if you ever find anyone who uses that term, you know right away you're dealing with somebody who's not only a Cold Warrior, not only an anti-communist, but is not interested in the truth. Okay, that's a key tip-off.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the same thing about the word authoritarianism. People use that a lot when they talk about the Soviet Union and even like North Korea or Cuba. I just think it's really fascinating that the public having a direct democracy is somehow bad. And I just don't understand why people are against the people having authority over the government and over how society is run for the working class. I think it's really counterintuitive to be against the authoritarianism or the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I see people sending me to these like same sources. I see Hannah Arendt come up a lot. And
Domenico Lacerda, the late Domenico Lacerda, has some books and articles where he goes into some of these terms and shows how invalid they are, but without going into any more depth. That's a key term. Anybody who uses that term, that they're giving off a certain signal. The signal is that they're super anti-communist. They're not interested in the facts because the facts just won't support them. Okay, what's
next question? Right?
Sure. So we know that a famine did happen in Ukraine. And something you said earlier, I thought was really interesting. You said that like the famines had stopped happening after collectivization. So I'm wondering if you could tie that into your answer here. But we know that a famine happened in Ukraine, but there's a myth that it was deliberately caused by Stalin. Who was behind this myth, and how did the famine actually happen? And can we talk about the fallacy behind the Ukrainian national narrative?
Sure. Again, I think I have 2 chapters on that in Blood Lies. The key research has been done by a professor at West Virginia University named Mark Tauger. Most of his research is online at, research.org or academia.org or someplace like that. You could Google it. But he's really, really a great researcher. He's devoted his life to writing about Soviet agriculture and Russian agriculture generally. Okay, so very briefly, there have been famines every 3 or 4 or 5 years for as long as recorded history exists in Russia. So at least 1,000, 1,100 years. There were 4 famines in the 1920s alone. It became clear to the Soviet leadership that development of the country could not take place with the medieval forms of agriculture that existed in Russia. Okay, small peasant plots, often very far apart, people plowing often with wooden plows, having to hire horses. Sometimes they had to pull the plows themselves. It was ridiculous. It's a medieval form of agriculture. This made famine inevitable, and famines killed hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. So that was a major impetus for collectivization. Actually, it was the major impetus. It's sometimes stated, less now than it used to be, that agriculture was collectivized in order to sort of super exploit the peasants to use the production of the collective farms and state farms to fund industrialization. That's not true. In fact, the state poured more resources into collectivization than they got out of it. Collectivization was necessary to stop this endless cycle of famines. Collectivization was basically finished by 1932, but 32, 33 saw a very bad famine. Talger goes into the details. I repeat them in Blood Lies. I also repeat them in my book of last year called Stalin Waiting for the Truth. This is Talger's analysis that the famine was caused by natural causes, by drought in some places, flooding in other places, bad weather, locusts, mice, rodents, and of course, the government did not understand that this was more than a local famine here and a local crop failure here and a local crop failure there, until something like the end of January 1933, when they finally got the big picture. And after that, the government started to give massive aid to those places that were experiencing famines, including Ukraine. And by the way, the famine was, if anything, worse in Kazakhstan than it was in Ukraine. But of course, it wasn't confined to Ukraine. It was in the central Black Earth region. It was in various sections of Russia as well. But it was worse in Kazakhstan. So anybody who says this is a Ukrainian famine is essentially,
they're denying.
Ignoring Kazakhstan, which is, why are you doing that? The Talger points out that the Russian government, the Soviet government, took effective steps to stop the famine, to help the peasants overcome it, and it was overcome. And as a result of collectivization, there were no more large-scale famines. There were still local crop failures here and there, but there were no more large-scale famines. Until 1947, 48, when there was a Europe-wide agricultural crisis caused by bad weather. Several 100,000, at least, Germans died, for example, of this famines in 1947, 48. And of course, several 100,000 Soviets died, and there was major problems in England and France as well. So that famine has been studied, and it certainly wasn't the fault of the Soviet government, although the anti-communists say it was. But there's been good studies. Stephen Wheatcroft wrote a very good article about it, pointing out that it wasn't their fault. So with the exception of that post-war famine, there were no more famines after collectivization. Collectivization was actually one of the great successes of social organization in the 20th century. It stopped this 1,000-year cycle of devastating famines. Now, it's sometimes said, with some truth, that if collectivization had not taken place in 1930 to 32, the famine of 32, 33 might have been less severe, conceivably, possibly. But the point is, if collectivization hadn't taken place, there would not only have been the famine of 32, 33, but there would have been the cycle of famines every 3 or 4 or 5 years would have continued anyway. So that people were going to die in any case. And in one of his volumes of his History of the Second World War, Winston Churchill repeats or attempts to repeat a conversation he had with Stalin at some point during the war. And Stalin said it was terrible, it was very difficult, the collectivization, but it was necessary to stop the famines. He says it right there. That was why they did it. It was the main reason. So it was very successful. Now, dishonest scholars will say, like Snyder says in that book, just says, oh, well, collectivization didn't work. Collectivization worked actually very, very well. So that's the story with the famine of 32, 33. Now, where did the story about the deliberate famine come along? There's a good book about this. Unfortunately, it's in Ukrainian. Certainly the Nazis and the pro-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists back in the 30s talked about this. They didn't call it the Holodomor, but they talked about how the Soviets were perhaps deliberately starving the Ukrainians. The story of the deliberate famine really gets going in a big way in the 1980s among the Ukrainian nationalists. And what happens after Ukraine becomes independent, in 1990, I guess, is that the pro-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists who had fled to Germany, England, Canada, especially the United States, started to flood back into independent Ukraine and played a very important role in formulating the nationalist ideology of that country. So that the Ukrainian fascists became national heroes because they were fighting for independence, and the fact that they weren't really fighting for the Germans, they weren't really fighting for Hitler, they were fighting for independence. And then, of course, the Holodomor story is made compulsory. In this particular case, no reputable Western anti-communist scholar accepts the story of the Holodomor, which is interesting, right? Because it certainly makes Stalin and the Soviets look terrible, but it just nobody accepts it. And Applebaum accepts it, but she's not really a scholar. She's she's a publicist, anti-communist publicist. She wrote a book called Red Famine. It got terrible reviews. Oh, it did. It's a terrible book. Very dishonest. I'm talking about terrible reviews from people who are in the mainstream here.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
But the Ukrainians push it, and they're not really interested. I mean, it's not important to them that the scholars don't agree with it. The point is, if you can do a leapfrog over the scholars and get to the mass media, okay, and promote it in the mass media, you can convince a certain number of people, and that has happened. Many people now think that there was a Holodomor. There's a big monument to it, to the victims of the Holodomor in Washington, D.C. It was paid for by the Ukrainian government, but if you look at it sort of in photographs or as you're driving by, you can't tell that. The Ukrainian nationalists have a journal of Holodomor studies. They have books and articles on it. They have conferences about it, just as though it really happened. And that's the way you do it. That's the way you invent an atrocity that never took place.
Right, and it's just, even Robert Conquest even retracted it.
Even he retracted. Yes, he did. But of course, they don't publicize that. I mentioned that in my book someplace. But,
yeah, you did. Definitely, you did.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question I have here is, what do we truly know about what happened at Katyn? And how come Poland, Ukraine, and Russia don't want to discuss evidence that casts doubt on the official version?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book about this, right? So Katyn is a generic term for the killing of some thousands, many thousands, of Polish prisoners of war who were taken prisoner by the Soviets in 1939 when they entered what was then Eastern Ukraine, and okay, but to them was Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine. I'm sorry, Eastern Poland, but to them was Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine. And the Soviets certainly captured many thousands of Polish soldiers. They released the rank and file, but they kept the officers. Polish nationalists were very anti-Soviet and very anti-communist, but they were forced, because they were living at the sufferance of the British, to formally ally with the Soviet Union against Germany during World War II, although they were not particularly anti-German, and they were certainly extremely anti-Soviet, but they didn't have any choice. So they and the Nazis cooked up this story where the Germans dug up a whole bunch of bodies, claiming these were bodies of Polish prisoners of war who had been shot by the Soviets in 1940, in the spring of 1940, at Katyn. Initially this was rejected. Of course, the Polish government in exile during the war accepted it. And as a result, the Soviets, who had no illusions about these people, the Soviets broke relations with the Polish government in exile and formed their own Polish nationalist group, which ended up, after the war, becoming the government of Poland. Okay, Polish nationalists, anti-communists were put on the shelf. Of course, the Allies continued to support them. The Allies supported the Soviet version, which was that the Germans had done it, up until the Cold War got underway. And after that, they flipped. And they said, no, 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 we were wrong. We accept the Polish nationalist narrative. It was the Soviets who did it. The Soviets continued to deny this right up until 1980, publicly until 1989, privately until 1988, Soviet government under Gorbachev. In 89, Gorbachev said the Soviets were guilty. In 91, Gorbachev gave to Yeltsin documents which he claimed had been found in the archive that proved Soviet guilt. In 92, Yeltsin gave them to the Poles, and that's what made, the newspapers. So, as of October 16th or 17th, 1992, the world has been told that the Soviets were guilty and that there's documents proving. Well, I've just gotten word that an article of mine, which I wrote recently, has been approved for publication, in which I detail the evidence that has come to light since 1992, since then. And to make a long story short, it's very clear. It is impossible that the Soviets were guilty of shooting all these Poles. But there has been some falsification of evidence. It's certainly the case that both under Khrushchev and then again under Gorbachev, some documents were falsified to make it look like the Soviets were guilty. Now, Khrushchev evidently started to blame the Soviets and then backed off. But Gorbachev went through with it. So I've been interested in this topic, I don't know, for many years, but, in a kind of more than curiosity manner since the late 90s. And I figured at some point or other, I was just going to have to do a thorough study, all right? And so I did. And it took a number of years. It was very interesting. And it's very clear that once you look at the documents which cannot possibly have been falsified, and I managed to identify some, they all either point to Soviet innocence or to German guilt. So why does it live on? Well, first of all, it is foundational to Polish anti-war, post-communist, post-communist, anti-communist Polish nationalism. Okay, it's the major Polish nationalist right-wing myth that Poland was a victim of World War II. Actually, Poland was one of the perpetrators of World War II, but you can't say, it's against the law to say that in Poland. Mm-hmm. It's the myth is that Poland was a victim. Poland was a victim too, but it was a victim because of its own government. Anyway, but it's also the best documented sort of quote, quote, crime of Stalin. None of the other alleged crimes of Stalin are nearly as well documented as this. But the only way you can say it's documented is if you ignore all the problems with the documentation and then you ignore all the evidence that contradicts it. But how many people are going to really look at that, you know? So I did this research, I wrote this book. One of the first things that happened is I was on a historian's email list called H Poland. I got kicked off. Just kicked off. You're off the list. They didn't tell you why, but I know why. It's because I published that book.
Right.
Then a young scholar of the Soviet Union, American scholar of the Soviet Union, young woman, contacted me. We were in touch, and she said, "Oh, you know, I'm one of the people who does a sort of podcast, a new books podcast. We do podcasts about new books. So we'll do a podcast on with you about your book on Katyn." And we did it. And she sent it to the overall editor of the podcast, and he refused to post it. He said, "No, you know, this is crazy. Everybody knows the Soviets did it. You can't, I'm not going to publish a podcast where this guy says they didn't do it." So, so that's the story, and it's a very interesting mystery. Actually, I call my book "The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre." It was very interesting to me, and it might be interesting to you, to take a look at how to identify the evidence, gather the evidence, study the evidence, draw conclusions from the evidence. It was a fascinating project. Then that book has been translated so far into 2 or 3 other languages, and 2 or 3 more are coming. So it's translated to Russian, French, it's going to be coming out in Czech, it's being translated into Polish, that'll be interesting. I might have forgotten 1 or 2 others. Because, so this is a matter of considerable interest, mm-hmm. that even this very famous issue has been completely falsified. The Soviets absolutely didn't do it. There's no way they could have done it, and the evidence that given the evidence that has survived. Did that answer your question? I don't remember that.
Yeah, what evidence has survived?
Well, quite a bit, but there's sort of 2 things. First of all, there are a lot of pieces of evidence, and if you read my book, you'll see that there's a lot. But you know, you have to. I decided at the introduction to my book, I say this. I said, there's an enormous amount of stuff written about Katyn, but most of it is not primary source evidence of the actual crime. Okay, I mean, because it's certainly a crime. Somebody shot all these people, right? So there was a crime. The question is, who did it? So you have to wade through this thousands of pages of stuff that's been written about Katyn and find out, just ask yourself what the evidence is. And then it's the evidence, some of that evidence points to Soviet guilt, and some of that evidence points to German guilt. So you have to, so it's no good just saying, well, we have evidence that points to Soviet guilt and evidence that points to German guilt, so we'll never know. So I decided that the only way to really determine this is to look at the evidence that could not have been falsified. Because it's clear that some of this evidence has been falsified. If you have evidence that A killed B and evidence that C killed B, they can't both be true. So how do you deal with this? I decided that the way to deal with it is to find to identify evidence that could not have been falsified. And if you read the book, you'll see, okay, how I go about doing that. Again, the fact is that in mainstream discourse, it is not tolerated to say the Soviets were not guilty. Okay, it's not tolerated. That's not a viewpoint that you can legitimately take, even though, unless you have studied this issue in depth, you really have no idea what the evidence is. Like the guy who said, we won't publish your podcast. Everybody knows the Soviets did it. He's a scholar of the Soviet Union. He clearly never studied this question. You just take it for granted that all of these well-known people who say that the Soviets were guilty must be telling the truth, right? How could they all be wrong? Of course, there are some people in Russia who say that the Soviets weren't guilty, but you could just, they're Russians, they're communists. What do you want? So it's not only an example of a myth about Stalin or the Stalin era Soviet Union that happens to be false and deliberately false, but it's a sort of measure of how dishonest this field is, this whole field is. I urge you to read the book. It has convinced enough people around the world that it's been translated and is in the course of being translated into other languages. And I think, I'd like to see your criticisms. There have been a couple of sort of abortive attempts at criticizing it by anti-communist writers, but they've only been able to deal with it by ignoring most of what I say, secure in the knowledge that most people aren't going to run out and buy my book, right? They're just going to read what they can read online or something like that. They're not going to go out and actually study this question. If you don't go out and study the question, then then it's a question of credibility. So let me say a word about credibility. Sometimes I get asked, or people say, well, does Furr have any credibility? Or people say to you, are you credible? And I always say, no, I'm not credible. You shouldn't go around believing me. The question is, you shouldn't go around believing anybody. You need to look at the evidence. Okay, credibility just means, are you saying the kind of things that these other people are saying, these legitimated figures? If you say what they say, then you have credibility, right? If you don't say what they say, then you don't have credibility. What's that got to do with discovering the truth? Nothing. But people are confused by terms like that. Anyhow.
Yeah, no, they definitely get thrown around too loosely.
Yep.
So we want to ask you, have you come across any legitimate criticisms of Stalin, and might one of those be the recriminalization of homosexuality in the USSR?
Sure.
What was behind that, and maybe we can go into what were the forces behind that decision?
Sure, and let me just combine it with this issue of conditions of women, attitude towards prostitution, stuff like that. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, well, here's a story. I haven't done research on this. So the question is, if you wanted to know the answer to that question, how would you go about it? Any question like this, and you would have to go down. First of all, you would have to see if anybody, you should certainly start by trying to see if anybody has written any serious studies on this question, on these questions. And they probably have. These are just not specific topics that I have researched. You'd start there to get some bibliography. But then, once you do that, you're going to have to go back to the Soviet sources of that time period. Now, we have a lot of them available now. I mean, you got to go to some trouble to get your hands on them, but there are, in principle, there are a lot of Soviet sources available. You have to know how to read Russian, obviously. Um, and then you have to go back and take a look at how these issues were discussed at the time that these laws were changed. And you need to, you just need to discuss that. For example, the business about abortion, I think that's part of it. There was a big discussion about this. I don't know the details of it, but this was a major open discussion in the press and in magazines, and soliciting comments from ordinary people, but also from doctors and so forth. And my guess is it's the same with homosexuality. I have not done that work, so I don't know what the result of such a study would be, but I personally would be surprised if the Soviet Union at that time or at any time took a position that was qualitatively different from the position taken by the Western capitalist medical establishment. Because who are the doctors in the Soviet Union? Okay? Who are they? Who are the people who are the accredited experts on questions of health, which includes pregnancy and birth? It also includes sexuality, right? Who are the experts of this? Who are the world experts? The Soviet doctors were going to international conferences about these things. They were permitted to do this and rub elbows with their Western counterparts. So my guess is that the Soviet laws would have ultimately ended up being probably not too much different from the laws of the Western capitalist societies. That's my guess. Okay. What I think should be avoided is the kind of, but I don't know, you'd have to study it, but that I would be surprised if it were any different from that. Because why? Why would it be? But it'd be interesting to know. One of the issues that comes up from time to time is things like this. And you hear it from Trotskyists, but you also hear it from others. Stalin changed the laws on homosexuality. Stalin changed the laws on prostitution or abortion. Well, my guess would be that Stalin had little or nothing to do with these things. Okay, of course, if he had come out in opposition, then they probably wouldn't have happened. But why would he do that? Stalin didn't pretend to be an expert in psychology or medicine or any of this stuff. So this kind of stuff would have been dealt with by these public discussions in the press, also in the semi-popular press, and also in the expert press. And that's the way they would have been handled. Just dealing with the issue of homosexuality, my guess would be that most, if not all, Western capitalist countries had made homosexuality illegal.
Correct.
Okay.
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah. So what was the basis for thinking that that Soviet doctors, all but a handful of which would have been, not been communists in any real ideological sense, and probably many of whom would have gone to medical school under the Tsars, and also who read Western journals and attended Western conferences and so forth, why would they be much different? And likewise with abortion. The additional issue with regard to abortion, which of course affects potentially a huge number of people, is that the science of birth control and even the techniques of abortion in the 1930s were very, very different from what they are today. Abortion was a very serious surgical procedure, quite dangerous, if not dangerous to life, and sometimes it was dangerous to making a woman infertile. It was not a casual procedure, and of course and to use abortion as a means of birth control is, you know, I mean, it's really, at best, it would be very, very risky. Okay, that's not going to be an effective mass measure of birth control. However, the way to solve it is to go back to the primary sources and see how the debate developed. I don't know. And so I would leave that line open. In general, it's a mistake to think that because there was a revolution, which was a violent event, the Bolsheviks took state power, that somehow or other they were supposed to come up with ideas that we now think are almost obvious, you know, that we almost take for granted. Not everybody in our society takes them for granted. You know, progressive people take them for granted. Somehow or other, there 100 years ago, they would have just somehow come up with these ideas. And there was something wrong with them that they didn't think then the way we think now. My guess is one of the reasons we think the way we think now has a lot to do with the debates that have taken place in the last 100 years, not only in the Soviet Union, but in the medical establishment and so on, you know, over the past century. And that's why we think the way we think today. So, but I don't know. If I were going to research the issue of abortion or homosexuality, that's the way I would go about doing it.
Yeah, and then we had the question about how were the conditions of women under Stalin during.
Yeah, there's some pretty good books about that, and the issue is that I think some progress was made in asserting more equality for women, but it was more limited than we would think appropriate today. They made some advances, certainly in many of the more economically or culturally backward areas. I mean, there are famous examples of, you know, the women in the Islamic republics tearing off their veils, and some of them getting murdered by men because this was considered, you know, horrible. The burqas, you know, these total whole body veils. Women going to professional schools and getting education and becoming workers in factories and so forth. So there was a lot of assertion of women's in the direction of women's roles in the direction of equality, but it certainly never reached full equality. And there's a pretty good scholar about this stuff, Wendy Goldwyn of Carnegie Mellon University. Is that where she teaches? I think she teaches at Carnegie Mellon. Her name is Wendy Z. Goldwyn. And she does very good research in questions of, she has books on workers and she has books on women. And I recommend her work with this one proviso. She does this research on these topics, and when she does it, in my experience, it's good stuff. To make it acceptable, she puts it in the anti-Stalin framework. Okay, so you did this research and then you put it in this framework, which is the anti-Stalin paradigm, which makes it look, which makes the whole business look far more negative than it should. But she has done good research on the role of women, and if I were going to do research on the role of women, that's where I would start. As for homosexuality, I know that there must be some research out there. I don't know it. And I haven't done it. So, you know, it should be done. But that's the way you would do it. That's the right way to do it, is to go back and look at the primary sources, look at the discussions, look at what the medical community was saying, look at the discussions within in the mass media and the semi-popular press. If you could find any discussions in the political bodies, the Politburo, the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet nationalities, the various provincial Republican bodies, that would also be interesting. But that's the way to go about it, to find out why. Yes, it is interesting that at first it was decriminalized and then later criminalized. The same with abortion, first decriminalized and then later criminalized. Yeah. That would be
right. But and I think it also, I think this speaks to how progressive and far advanced it was for women in the USSR during that time under Stalin, because the material conditions were so much better for women in the USSR that even prostitution was eradicated.
Yeah, largely. There's a pretty good book by a guy named William Mandel. Not written in the Stalin period, but written in the 50s or maybe the early 60s. He was in the Communist Party. I mean, he went along with Khrushchev, like most of them did, but he was very interested in these kinds of social issues in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And it's been a long time since I read that book. It is a pretty good book on Soviet women, and it's sort of a semi-popular book on Soviet women.
What was the book called?
I don't remember the title, but his name is William Mandel. If you go to a big bibliography, like if you go to OCLC, WorldCat, which is a big mega bibliography online, worldcat.org, and it's a meta catalog of many scholarly catalogs around the world. Go to worldcat.org and put in his name. I mean, there may be other people by that name. Keep on leafing through it. You'll find it. You'll find his book. Okay. He was from San Francisco. He just died a few years ago. He wrote a pretty good book on Soviet women. So yeah, I mean, certainly progress was made, but it had a certain limitation. And let me recommend a novel. There was a novel published in the 1930s called Moscow Yankee by an American writer named Myra Page, who was definitely in the Communist Party. And it was republished 10 or 12 years ago by, I think, University of Illinois Press, along with some other radical novels, Moscow Yankee. And it deals with an American worker. It's fictional, of course. It deals with an American worker who goes to Moscow. And among other things, a couple of women who come in and out of his life, a kind of a bourgeois woman and then a working class woman who works in a factory and who's a dedicated communist and so forth. And there's a good introduction by a friend of mine, Barbara Foley, to that book. And she points out this issue, the progressive aspects of the assertion of women's equality, and then the limitations of it as well. So it's a good introduction.
I appreciate the resources, and I wish that a lot of people did that more often, where they're not well versed. They say, "Oh, I haven't done the research into that." So I appreciate your transparency there.
Sure,
that means a lot. And I've learned a lot in just the past couple hours, and I've been taking some notes. I've got all the books pulled up here now, so I'm really excited to.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Don't hesitate to email me or stay in touch. I'd like to stay in touch with you.
Yeah, I'd love that too.
We have one final question before we wrap up.
Yes.
I can't believe we made it. We never usually get to finish our questions, but you are so gracious to, we really appreciate you taking the time to answer answer our question.
Thank you.
Mitch, why don't you, or Fox, sorry.
Yeah. So as I'm involved with a lot of abolitionist work here in Chicago, and so whenever I talk to people about communism or the USSR, they're always like gulags, you tanky. But
what they say? I'm sorry, say that again.
they shout about gulags and they call me
gulag. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you would talk about the various kinds of penal systems that existed in the USSR. Mm-hmm. What were the true numbers in regards to those sentenced as common criminals and political prisoners, and what was the system really like? And what view should we take of them?
Well, gulag has become a name that is used to refer to the camps, but it's actually means the system, the administrative system of the camps. So the idea behind camps was that people should work as opposed to sitting around in cells, okay? And so they were labor camps. And a lot of them were in the north because Russia as a whole is mainly much further north than the United States is. During the Stalin period, there were no such things as really as political prisoners. Everybody got a trial. Everybody got charged who's in a camp. Everybody got charged with a crime. Charged with the crime, you got a trial. And if you were convicted, you got a sentence. The defendants in the Moscow trials, for example, were not political prisoners. They were convicted of very serious crimes. As murder, conspiracy to murder, espionage, and stuff like this, right? Now, those are criminal offenses. They're not political in the sense of, well, they disagree with, they politically disagree. Nobody got sent to prison because they wrote a book that Stalin didn't like, or made a movie that Stalin didn't like. I didn't, or composed a symphony or a piece of music that Stalin or some other communist leader didn't like. Nobody got sent to prison for stuff like that. So I question the category of political prisoners, at least during the period that I've done research. Sure, most prisoners were ordinary criminals. To me, there are really just two questions that make any sense about anybody's penal system. I mean, the Soviet Union had a penal system. Every country has a penal system. One is, were the people who were sentenced to this penal system actually guilty of something? Did they get a trial? Were they found guilty? And of course, there are going to be people who were found guilty but were really innocent. That also happens in every penal system. How you determine that is an interesting question. It's not so simple sometimes. And secondly, what were the conditions in the prisons? What were the conditions in the gulags? There were exceptional cases in these labor camps, a couple of which were notoriously bad. We know about this because we now have documents that the leaders, the administrators who ran the Gulag system investigated complaints, and so we have a lot of documentation of that. So we know that there are some cases where there were bad conditions, where there were abuses by the prison administration. We know that particularly under Nikolai Yezhov, and I wrote a book about this, Yezhov versus Stalin, many people were imprisoned and many people were executed who were completely innocent. And that had to do with Yezhov's conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet government, which you could read about. But in general, they were not death camps. People served a term and then they were released. It's not like the German camps, which were either death camps or where you were never supposed to get out. So it's not a lot like that. In 1932-33, when there was a bad famine all over the country, which we were talking about before, and also in 1942 to 44, at the height of the war, when there was not enough food to feed everybody, workers were literally dying on the job, collapsing in factories and dying of starvation because so much of the food that they had was being sent to the soldiers at the front. The mortality rate among Soviet citizens was much higher in 32-33 and in 42-44. The mortality rate in the labor camps was also much higher. Okay, that's when the mortality rates were exceptionally high. They were high under Yezhov, and we know, and I quote that in my book, that once Yezhov was removed, the conditions got much better. Yezhov had deliberately made the conditions bad, and I write about why that was. So that exaggerating the conditions, the bad conditions of the camps and the number of casualties, started back in the early 50s with a couple of anti-communist Russian emigres in the United States. The most famous being Boris Nikolaevsky, who wrote a book about this. But it really got going under Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn, I don't know, I mean, Solzhenitsyn just fabricated stuff, just made it up, and is never used as a historical source. And he never claimed, by the way, to be a historical, that he was a historical source. He was just reporting what, he said he was reporting what people told him, word of mouth, rumors, stuff like that. But the Gulag Archipelago has made a big impression on public consciousness.
That's Anne Applebaum's book, right? That's Anne Applebaum's book?
No, that's Alexander Solzhenitsyn back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, got it.
Okay, so Applebaum's book, I mean, if you look at the parts, or for that matter, Oleg Khlevniuk, who is super anti-communist scholar, Russian scholar, but a lot of his stuff is translated now. If you just look at the documents, you just look at the evidence that they cite and not their narration, which of course is super anti-Stalin, super anti-communist. You look at the evidence they cite, you get a pretty good picture of what's going on, because we had the Soviets kept terrific records, and especially of abuses, of the investigations of abuses. I mean, when there weren't any abuses, there weren't any investigations. But when there were abuses, there were investigations and lots of documents produced, and we have all that stuff. Okay, there's a lot of documentation about the Gulag, and there's a lot of information about how many people died, what they died of, which camps they died in, what were the totals every year. We have lots and lots and lots of that kind of information, much more than we have, by the way, for the United States. I mean, try to find out how many people died in jails, prisons, chain gangs, whatever, in any year in the 1930s. It's impossible. I know, because my office here is right next to the Justice Studies Department, and that's the kind of research some of these people do. And they say, oh, you can't find that out. First of all, there were 48 states, and they all keep their records. There was no central archive keeping these records. There were big, and of course, the French had Devil's Island. The Americans had chain gangs. There was a big scandal in the 1920s and 30s about chain gangs in the United States. There was nothing like that in the Soviet Union. But there were some abuses, and they've been well publicized. The idea that people were sent to the Gulag because they didn't, I don't know, for more or less arbitrary reasons, for no reason at all, is just not borne out by the documentation. There's one example that I'll give you, and I know you want to wrap it up. There's a famous case of a young communist woman in the 1930s named Yevgenia Ginsburg, who was communist. She was accused by some of her co-workers. She was tried, she was convicted, she was sent to a gulag. She spent a long time there. She got out under Khrushchev and wrote her memoirs. In English, they're called Out of the Whirlwind. Now, one or two people who were in prison with her said that she exaggerated this or exaggerated that. She claimed to be innocent. Everybody said she was innocent. In the early 90s, a very anti-communist Russian scholar, Alter Litvin, published two investigative dossiers that he managed to get a hold of Yevgenia Ginsburg. What was the evidence against her? There was actually quite a bit of evidence against her. It's not entirely clear from what he published that she was innocent, although she may have been innocent. But it's just, I mean, there was a lot of evidence against her. There was a lot of testimony against her. And so she got a trial, okay? It doesn't mean she was guilty. It also doesn't mean she was innocent. She got a trial, and there was lots of testimony and all that kind of stuff. So there was this kind of procedure that existed. And I think that what we lack, there are a couple of books that are pretty good in Russian on this subject, but what we really lack, and what's lacking in the field of Soviet history generally, and let me just close with this, is objectivity. In general, people are not looking for the truth. And if you don't look for the truth, you're not going to find it. Or if you find it, you won't recognize it. You got to try to be objective. You got to try to find the evidence and study it in an objective manner and not let your prejudices carry you away, because there's something, and you could look this up in Wikipedia, for example, something called the confirmation bias, the big fallacy. Look it up. Everybody out there watching this, look it up. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias means people tend to look with favor upon anything that looks like it might be evidence that supports their preconceived ideas and their prejudices, and they tend to poo-poo or to disregard or not take seriously any evidence that tends to contradict their preconceived ideas. Okay? And if you don't go into an investigation determined to be objective, that is, determined to give an especially sympathetic reading to evidence that contradicts your own prejudices, and to be especially suspicious of evidence that agrees with your own biases, that if you don't try to counteract your own biases in some way, it's the only way to operationalize objectivity, you're going to fall prey to confirmation bias, which means that you will end up coming to the conclusion that conforms to your own prejudices. And that is the field of Soviet studies in spades, okay? You're not allowed to come to conclusions that make Stalin or the Soviet Union in his day look at all positive. Everything has to be negative. And as a result, most of that research is really valueless. And most of the books that I read, the only valuable part, if there is anything, is in the footnotes, is for the sources, because I want to penetrate down to the sources, the primary sources that give the evidence, and then study them objectively and make up my own mind. So objectivity, that's what's at a premium, and that's what we need, and that's what we lack.
Absolutely. This
Great.
was very informative.
Thank you. Are you going to put it online, and can you tell me when you do?
Yes,
we will. Yes, we will
Thank
let
you.
you know.
Sometime this week, we're going to put it on our YouTube channel, The Red Lettuce. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about your amazing work.
Thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity to interact with you in this way, and for you to put this online. That's great. I feel that the world that there are more and more. I learn more and more about more and more young people like yourselves who are interested in the history of the Soviet Union and suspicious of the mainstream narrative, and it gives me a lot of confidence in the future.
Oh,
well, we wouldn't be here without work like yours. So we really appreciate all the effort and time. And
terrific. Thank you so much. Stay in touch.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, just remind everybody where they can find your work.
Oh, well, I have a home page, which you can find by Googling me. You can find, and that you can download all the articles that I've published on my home page. It gives you the titles of the books. You can find all the books on Amazon.com. They're also published, the publishers, Erythros Press and Media, and also Red Star Publishers, they also sell them, but the simplest thing to do is just to type my name into Amazon, and all my books will come up. Go to my homepage and get a list of all my articles, and and you can download them there.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye-bye.